In the early years of World War II, there was a man whose name remained largely unknown to the public, but who would play a pivotal role in one of the most consequential moments in modern history. His job? To create maps for the Allied forces in preparation for D-Day. This man, a cartographer by trade, was not a soldier, nor was he a figure who commanded attention. In fact, when he first began his work, many ridiculed his approach to mapmaking. He wasn't seen as someone capable of shaping the course of history. To his peers in the military, his work seemed like a trivial matter in comparison to the grand strategic plans of generals and commanders. The mapmaker's name was Major James L. McLaren, and he was responsible for creating detailed maps of Normandy. At the time, the operation was shrouded in secrecy, and few understood just how crucial, accurate maps would be for the success of the invasion. Most military planners believed that the success of the operation would hinge on brute force and the ability to overwhelm German defenses. Maps, they argued, were a secondary concern, just one piece of the puzzle. It wasn't uncommon for military experts to overlook the importance of detailed cartography, thinking that aerial reconnaissance and satellite technology, which was becoming more advanced at the time, would provide all the information needed. Yet, McLaren believed differently. He understood that the terrain in Normandy was complex, unpredictable, and dangerous. The beaches were littered with obstacles, the coastline was rocky, and the inland areas were full of hedgerows, ditches, and uneven fields. The Allies needed precise maps, not just to show where the enemy was, but to help troops navigate the landscape, avoid hidden dangers, and coordinate their movements under extreme pressure. McLaren didn't just provide a broad outline of the area. He focused on the intricate details, the subtle dips in the land, the distance between key landmarks, the layout of roads, and the positioning of potential German strongholds. This was the map that many military officials dismissed, too concerned with traditional strategies to see the value in his work. The skepticism McLaren faced was overwhelming. His maps were described as too detailed and unrealistic by many of the more traditional strategists. To them, it seemed absurd to focus on such minutiae when the enemy was likely to be bombed into submission, when the invasion would be a large-scale, coordinated assault that didn't have the luxury of navigating with extreme precision. McLaren's efforts were met with laughter from higher-ups who didn't fully appreciate the complexities of the terrain or the importance of well-prepared soldiers who could move through that terrain effectively. In military circles, where bold tactics and large, sweeping moves were valued, McLaren's careful, almost obsessive attention to detail didn't seem to fit the mold. Despite this ridicule, McLaren refused to be discouraged. He worked tirelessly, perfecting his maps and refining every inch of detail, even as those around him doubted his methods. It's said that he would spend hours meticulously studying photographs, aerial reconnaissance, and first-hand reports from the field to ensure that every map he created was as accurate as possible. His commitment to his work was unwavering, even when the higher-ups in the military didn't see the value in his designs. For McLaren, it wasn't about recognition, it was about doing everything in his power to make the invasion successful. He believed that the more knowledge the troops had about their surroundings, the higher their chances of survival. This dedication to accuracy in an often chaotic environment was what set McLaren apart, but at the time, no one could have predicted how significant his maps would become. His work, once mocked, would later be hailed as a key factor in preventing disaster during the D-Day landings. But it wasn't just his maps that would play a vital role. It was his unwavering belief in their importance, even when no one else did. McLaren's story is one of perseverance, a reminder that sometimes the smallest details can make the biggest difference. Little did anyone know, his mocked maps would prove to be one of the most important tools the Allies had during the critical moments of D-Day. The Normandy beaches, Omaha, Utah, Juno, Gold, and Sword, are etched into history as the landing sites for the largest seaborne invasion ever attempted. The 6th of June 1944, D-Day, marked the beginning of the end of Nazi occupation in Western Europe. But the significance of these beaches, situated along the northern coast of France, extended far beyond their picturesque appearance. They were the key to breaking the German hold on Europe and ensuring a successful Allied foothold on the continent. At the time, the Allies faced an incredibly daunting task. They needed to launch a military operation that would establish a bridgehead in Europe, allowing for the continued fight against Hitler's forces. The stakes were immense. Success meant the liberation of France and the eventual downfall of Nazi Germany. Failure would have resulted in a catastrophic defeat, one that could have altered the course of the war, perhaps beyond repair. This made the strategic planning behind D-Day crucial, and every detail mattered. The success of the operation rested not just on having enough troops, tanks, and aircraft. It depended on understanding the land they would be invading and how the troops would navigate it. Normandy was not a typical landing site. The beaches, while seemingly open and vulnerable, were surrounded by cliffs, dense forests, and a web of fortifications built by the Germans. The coastline was heavily fortified with bunkers, machine gun nests, and artillery positions, all designed to repel any amphibious assault. The Germans had also placed various obstacles along the beaches, stakes, barbed wire, and landmines, creating a deadly gauntlet for the invading troops. The geography of the region made the landing far more complicated than any previous amphibious invasion in history. But the difficulty of the terrain went beyond the beach itself. After the troops made it onto the beach, they had to navigate through areas that were far from uniform. The region was filled with difficult hedgerows, ditches, small rivers, and towns that were key to German supply lines. Some of these hedgerows were thick enough to obstruct tanks, and navigating these areas without proper maps could be disastrous. The Allies needed to know the location of every key landmark, road, and obstacle to ensure their success. Getting bogged down in difficult terrain or misjudging distances could lead to confusion, disorganization, and ultimately, failure. In this environment, the standard military maps used for general navigation weren't sufficient. They provided useful information about the broader landscape, but lacked the fine details necessary for troops to navigate the challenging, obstacle-laden terrain. The Allies needed to understand every inch of the battlefield, what it looked like, where the dangers were, and how to overcome them. This is where the importance of a mapmaker like Major James L. McLaren came into play. The detailed maps McLaren had created were a revelation for military planners. Unlike the conventional maps, McLaren's versions were focused on the minute details that would guide the soldiers through the chaos. They included the location of key enemy positions, the placement of natural obstacles, and even the layout of villages and towns that were strategically important for the Allies. These maps weren't just about showing the way they were, about giving soldiers the knowledge they needed to move effectively under fire, avoid danger, and secure critical points of the battlefield. They were more than just navigational tools. They were vital survival guides for the troops. But the road to Normandy wasn't without its challenges. By the time the invasion was being planned, the Allies had already suffered through years of difficult warfare. Their resources were spread thin across multiple theaters of battle, and every move had to be calculated. Normandy, with its rocky beaches and its unyielding terrain, was chosen for its strategic position. It offered a route into the heart of occupied France, bypassing heavily defended ports like Calais, which the Germans expected the Allies to target. However, the decision to land in Normandy was not without controversy. There were alternative locations considered, each with its own set of challenges. But Normandy was ultimately chosen for its relatively manageable distance from Britain and its proximity to key supply lines. This decision to invade Normandy was monumental, but without proper maps and an understanding of the lay of the land, the invasion would have been far more risky. The Allies knew they had to act quickly, and the mapmakers' work became more valuable with every passing day. What began as a mocked, overly detailed collection of maps turned into the bedrock of Allied planning for D-Day. But the mapmakers' work wasn't just a safeguard, it was a secret weapon, one that would be relied upon when the Allies hit the beaches and when every second of decision-making mattered. The Allies could not afford to make mistakes, and the land around Normandy would test every soldier's ability to navigate unfamiliar, hostile terrain. McLaren's maps were critical not only for the landings themselves, but also for the weeks that followed, as the Allies fought to push inland and secure the region. In a battle where terrain was as much an enemy as the German forces, McLaren's maps became the most important tool in the Allied arsenal, and it was only after the invasion was successful that the true value of his work became clear. As the D-Day invasion drew closer, Major James L. McLaren's work was still being met with skepticism by many in the military hierarchy. Despite his relentless attention to detail, his maps had been dismissed by many as unnecessary and overly complicated. The focus was on the grand strategy, air raids, naval bombardments, troop numbers, but few understood the critical role that McLaren's maps would play in guiding the soldiers through the treacherous terrain of Normandy. Many of the military leaders believed that the maps weren't going to make much of a difference in the heat of battle. It was the sheer force of the invasion that they believed would win the day, not the precision of the planning. But that was about to change. As June 6, 1944, approached, the pressure on the Allies intensified. The plan to invade Normandy was set in stone, and the beaches were ready to be stormed. Still, questions about logistics and the best way to navigate the difficult terrain persisted. There were doubts: would the forces be able to move inland quickly enough? Would they be able to avoid the German defenses, or would they be bogged down in the hedgerows and towns of Normandy? That's when the first real test of McLaren's maps came. On the morning of D-Day, as the Allied forces landed on the beaches, something unexpected happened. The weather, which had been unstable in the days leading up to the invasion, suddenly cleared. This gave the Allies the green light to proceed, but the delay also meant the troops had to land directly on the beaches under fire from entrenched German positions. The beaches were littered with obstacles, barbed wire, mines, and anti-tank traps. But McLaren's maps had accounted for every hazard, every bunker, and every piece of terrain that could be used as cover. As troops scrambled to shore, they used McLaren's maps to navigate the beachhead. Unlike the general maps that offered only broad outlines of the area, McLaren's detailed maps were a guide for soldiers who needed precise, actionable information. His maps showed where the German positions were, where obstacles were likely to be, and, crucially, where the safest routes for movement were. These details, which had previously been mocked as excessive, now proved essential. One of the most notable instances where McLaren's maps became a lifesaver was during the assault on Omaha Beach. This beach, in particular, had been heavily fortified by the Germans, and it became the site of intense fighting on D-Day. The terrain was difficult, there were steep cliffs that had been mined, and soldiers landing on the beach had to deal with both enemy fire and the physical challenges of navigating such a hazardous landscape. Without accurate maps showing the precise locations of obstacles, the Allies could have been overwhelmed by the defenses, leading to devastating casualties. But McLaren's maps helped guide the soldiers through the chaos. The detailed layout of the beach, including key landmarks and the placement of German defenses, allowed the soldiers to make critical decisions on the fly. They could avoid areas where mines were likely buried, move toward the safer pockets of cover, and take advantage of their surroundings to minimize exposure to enemy fire. The maps provided a clear mental picture of what to expect, reducing confusion and allowing the soldiers to focus on their mission rather than getting lost or caught off guard. McLaren's work also helped Allied leaders coordinate the landing zones. The planners had already selected the beaches for the landing, but it was McLaren's maps that enabled the troops to quickly identify the most strategic points of entry and exit. McLaren had marked the locations of key German positions, allowing commanders to adjust their strategy on the fly. The detailed maps also guided soldiers to specific points on the beach, helping them to establish secure footholds more efficiently. As the invasion continued and the Allies began to push inland, McLaren's maps were just as crucial. The hedgerows of Normandy, which had been a major concern for the Allies, were mapped out in great detail. These dense, thorny barriers were difficult to navigate and provided perfect cover for German soldiers. But McLaren's maps allowed the soldiers to navigate through the fields and hedgerows more effectively. Soldiers had a mental map of where to expect these obstacles, giving them the advantage in a situation where the terrain itself could become a deadly weapon. By the end of D-Day, McLaren's maps had proven their worth. They had saved countless lives and helped ensure the success of the invasion. What had once been mocked as overly detailed and unnecessary, was now hailed as a vital tool in the Allied victory. As the landings progressed, the mapmaker's work was integrated into every phase of the operation, and the importance of his detailed approach became more evident. In the aftermath of D-Day, McLaren's role in the success of the invasion was acknowledged, albeit quietly at first. While the broader strategy and the bravery of the soldiers took center stage, those who understood the intricacies of the operation knew that McLaren's maps had played a crucial role in guiding the troops to victory. The contrast between the initial skepticism and the eventual recognition of his contribution was striking. The same maps that had been laughed at were now being praised as one of the key factors in the success of D-Day. McLaren's work had gone from being a joke to a cornerstone of military strategy. His maps weren't just navigational tools, they were life-saving guides, helping soldiers survive the most dangerous beach landings in history. In the end, his attention to detail and his belief in the importance of maps had made all the difference. As the days drew closer to June 6, 1944, the stakes for the D-Day invasion could not have been higher. Every move made by the Allies had to be calculated with precision, as one misstep could result in disaster. Yet, behind the scenes, the invasion was facing a series of logistical, strategic, and even political challenges that threatened to undermine the entire operation. The meticulous planning that had gone into the assault was beginning to show cracks, and the uncertainty surrounding the operation was palpable. The invasion of Normandy wasn't just about landing on the beaches, it was about overcoming obstacles both on the ground and in the air, and even within the very alliances that made up the invading force. The first of these challenges was the weather. The Allies needed clear skies and calm seas to execute the invasion. But the weather in the Channel was notoriously unpredictable. The invasion was initially scheduled for June 5th, but bad weather forced a delay by 24 hours. With the delay came a looming sense of pressure. Every moment counted. General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the Allied planners knew that any further delay could mean losing the element of surprise or giving the Germans time to reinforce their defenses. The weather had already proven to be an unpredictable enemy, and with D-Day postponed by a day, the Allies now had a limited window of opportunity. In addition to the weather, there were significant concerns over the readiness of the forces themselves. The logistics of moving over 150,000 troops, along with thousands of tons of equipment, onto foreign soil was a monumental task. The Allies had spent months organizing and preparing, but no amount of planning could truly account for the sheer chaos of what lay ahead. While the troops were well trained, nothing could fully prepare them for the realities they would face on the beaches of Normandy. The beaches themselves were fortified with bunkers, mines, and barbed wire, and the coastal defenses were reinforced by a determined enemy that was not going to yield easily. In the days leading up to D-Day, there were also concerns about the troops' equipment. The landing craft, tanks, and vehicles were all designed for the assault, but there were serious questions about whether they would function properly once the invasion was underway. The tanks, in particular, had been adapted for the landing, but their speed and maneuverability in the rough terrain of Normandy were untested. Soldiers were concerned that many of the tanks would become bogged down in the sand or be rendered ineffective by the harsh conditions. There were also issues with the amphibious landing craft. These boats were designed to take troops from the ships to the shore, but they weren't perfect. Many were prone to getting stuck in the soft sands, or worse, being sunk by enemy fire before they could even reach the shore. Then there was the issue of the hedgerows, one of the most dangerous and difficult to navigate features of the Normandy countryside. These thick, dense rows of trees and shrubs, often reinforced by stone walls, were a major obstacle for the advancing forces. The Germans had fortified these areas, making them ideal defensive positions, and the Allies had little experience fighting in such an environment. To make matters worse, the Allies had underestimated the difficulty of moving through these hedgerows. Early intelligence reports failed to grasp the full extent of the challenges they would face, and no one could truly prepare for the difficulty of navigating the countryside once they pushed past the beaches. The hedgerows could hide enemy soldiers, artillery, and even armored vehicles, making the advance far more treacherous than initially anticipated. This is where McLaren's maps, the very ones that had been mocked by his peers, began to show their worth. While many were still focused on the broad strokes of the invasion, McLaren had spent countless hours ensuring that every detail of the Normandy terrain was captured with precision. His maps highlighted key choke points, the locations of major hedgerows, and potential obstacles that the Allies would face as they advanced inland. At first, these maps were seen as overly meticulous. After all, the major focus was on the beaches, not the hinterlands. Yet, as the invasion approached, it became clear that McLaren's attention to detail was not only necessary, it was vital. As the Allies prepared for the invasion, McLaren's maps became a lifeline. His work provided a detailed roadmap for soldiers and commanders alike. The intricate layout of the countryside, including the location of key hedgerows and obstacles, was invaluable for the soldiers who would be making the dangerous trek inland after the beachheads were secured. His maps were incorporated into the training of the troops, giving them a mental picture of what to expect once they moved beyond the beaches. The maps also informed strategic decisions about where to place troops and how to coordinate the landings and follow-up assaults. The precision of his maps ensured that the Allies were better prepared for the challenges they would face. Despite the growing reliance on McLaren's maps, there were still significant doubts in the upper echelons of military command. The weather was still a concern, and there were worries that the invasion could fail, even with the right maps and equipment. Some commanders even questioned whether the Allies should delay the invasion further, fearing that the losses would be too great. But Eisenhower, recognizing that the operation could not be postponed indefinitely, made the fateful decision to move forward on June 6th. The invasion would proceed with the maps in hand, and with the understanding that the weather, the terrain, and the challenges ahead were simply obstacles to be overcome. As the operation moved forward, it was clear that the early struggles, the weather, the equipment issues, the hedgerows, were only the beginning of what would become a difficult, bloody fight. The challenges ahead would test the limits of the Allies' strategic planning, but thanks to McLaren's maps, they were better prepared to face the harsh realities of the battle ahead. In a campaign where every inch of ground mattered, McLaren's meticulous attention to detail became an invaluable asset in ensuring the success of D-Day. The morning of June 6, 1944, was tense with anticipation. Allied forces had spent months preparing for this moment, the largest amphibious invasion in history. The code name for the operation was Overlord, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The fate of Europe rested on the success of this mission. After months of planning, deception, and strategic positioning, the time had finally come for the Allied forces to storm the beaches of Normandy. For the soldiers on the ground, the anticipation was unbearable. On the ships, soldiers sat in silence, feeling the weight of the moment press down on them. Many had never experienced combat, and they had no idea what awaited them on the beaches. The weather had cooperated enough for the operation to move forward, but it was still a gamble. The weather was unpredictable, and the sea was choppy. As the landing craft made their way toward the shore, the tension was palpable. They were about to land in one of the most dangerous places on Earth. For the soldiers, the Normandy beaches were far from a serene beach vacation. These were beaches littered with obstacles, mines, barbed wire, and a heavily fortified German defense. The air was thick with anticipation and fear. The soldiers' minds were racing as they prepared for the chaos of landing. But they had been trained for this moment. They had learned about the geography, the tactics, and the strategy of D-Day. They had been briefed on the enemy's positions, the threats they would face, and the terrain they would have to navigate. And it was McLaren's maps that helped give them the knowledge they needed to survive. As the landing craft approached the shore, the soldiers knew they had to move quickly. The German defenses were waiting for them. The beach, with its steep cliffs and well-placed bunkers, would be a killing zone if the soldiers weren't careful. They had only one shot to make it count. The maps, designed by McLaren, had become their lifeline. These weren't just general maps. They were detailed, offering information on enemy positions, potential hazards, and key landmarks. The soldiers had been trained to read them, and now, As they waded into the surf, those maps would be their guide through the chaos. The first wave of troops landed on Utah and Omaha beaches, and as they disembarked from the landing craft, they were met with immediate resistance. German machine guns opened fire, and artillery shells rained down on the beach. Soldiers were cut down in an instant. But amid the chaos, McLaren's maps proved to be more than just a lifeline, they were a survival tool. The detailed locations of enemy positions helped the soldiers navigate through the deadly fire. They knew where the German bunkers were located, where the barbed wire was placed, and where the mined areas lay. On Omaha Beach, the most heavily fortified of the landing zones, the soldiers faced intense resistance. The Germans had established a near-impenetrable defense, and the soldiers landing on the beach were under heavy fire from the moment they stepped off the landing craft. Many of the landing craft were destroyed before they even reached the shore, and the men who made it to the beach were forced to fight for every inch of ground. But the detailed maps, which showed the layout of the beach and the location of German positions, allowed the soldiers to take cover and avoid some of the worst danger. The soldiers could see, through McLaren's maps, which areas were safest to run to and where the German artillery was concentrated. While the soldiers on Omaha Beach faced fierce opposition, those landing on Utah Beach encountered less resistance. The Germans were not as heavily entrenched at Utah, and the terrain allowed the soldiers to advance more quickly. The maps, which had been mocked only months before, helped the soldiers find key routes that allowed them to bypass German defenses and move inland faster. As the landing progressed, the importance of the maps became clearer to everyone on the ground. McLaren's work was no longer something to be mocked, it was a critical part of the operation's success. One of the most important aspects of the mapmaker's work was his inclusion of detailed routes that soldiers could take to avoid obstacles on the beach. The map didn't just show where the enemy was positioned, it showed where the land was safest to move through. The soldiers used these routes to avoid heavily fortified positions and to stay ahead of the advancing German counterattacks. The maps also highlighted key objectives, such as villages and towns, which were essential to securing the region after the initial landings. McLaren's maps provided the soldiers with a mental picture of the battlefield, helping them make split-second decisions in the heat of battle. As the hours passed, the beachhead slowly began to solidify. By mid-morning, more troops were landing, and the Allies had gained a foothold on the beaches. But the battle was far from over. The soldiers had made it past the German defenses on the beaches, but they still had to contend with the difficult terrain beyond the sand. The hedgerows, which had once been a distant concern, were now a deadly obstacle. The soldiers had to navigate through them, and the maps continued to guide them as they moved inland. The landing on D-Day was an incredible success, but it was only the beginning of the fight. The real challenges lay in the days that followed, as the Allies fought to push the Germans back and establish a strong foothold in France. The beachhead was just the first step. But even as the battle raged on, McLaren's maps continued to play a crucial role in guiding the troops. Without the detailed maps, the Allies would have been forced to navigate the rough terrain without direction. But McLaren's work gave them the knowledge they needed to succeed. The D-Day landings were an unprecedented military operation, and the success of the operation relied on more than just the strength of the soldiers. The maps created by Major James L. McLaren were an essential part of the strategy that made the landing successful. His work, once mocked, proved to be a critical element of the invasion, one that saved countless lives and helped turn the tide of the war in favor of the Allies. As the invasion progressed and the Allies began to push inland, the true value of Major McLaren's maps became increasingly clear. What had initially been seen as an unnecessary level of detail became one of the most crucial tools in ensuring the success of the operation. The soldiers, having made it past the beachhead and into the countryside, now faced new challenges. The terrain of Normandy, particularly the infamous hedgerows, became a defining feature of the battle, and it was in these moments that McLaren's maps provided the advantage that the Allies so desperately needed. The hedgerows were not just natural barriers, they were strategically significant obstacles that had been fortified by the Germans. These dense walls of earth and vegetation, often reinforced with stone or concrete, were so thick that they created a maze-like environment. They offered perfect cover for German troops, and advancing through them was difficult for the Allies. The hedgerows slowed their progress, and the soldiers had to fight for every inch of ground. Without McLaren's maps, the Allied forces would have been at a severe disadvantage in navigating these obstacles. But McLaren's meticulous attention to detail had provided a way through them. The maps showed the precise locations of the hedgerows and the pathways that could be used to bypass them. McLaren had studied the terrain in such detail that he was able to pinpoint the best routes for the advancing forces to take. His maps indicated the locations of roads, bridges, and open fields that could be used to avoid the most heavily defended areas. This allowed the soldiers to move more efficiently, avoid bottlenecks, and gain a tactical advantage as they pushed deeper into enemy territory. The maps provided a mental roadmap for the soldiers, allowing them to anticipate what lay ahead and avoid getting trapped by the enemy. One of the most significant ways McLaren's maps made a difference was in helping the Allies secure key towns and villages in the region. These small towns, though seemingly insignificant, held strategic importance for the Germans. They were vital supply hubs, and their capture would give the Allies control of important routes for moving troops and equipment. The Allies needed to know exactly where these towns were and how best to approach them. McLaren's maps highlighted these locations with precise details, allowing the troops to plan their advances and target these towns with pinpoint accuracy. For example, the town of Carrington, which lay between Utah Beach and the American forces' next objective, was critical for controlling the area. The German forces had heavily fortified the town, and capturing it would be key to the success of the overall operation. But the roads leading into Carrington were littered with obstacles and traps. The Germans had created strong defensive positions in and around the town, and the Americans would need to be strategic in their approach. McLaren's maps showed the precise layout of the town, the location of key defensive positions, and the best routes for advancing troops. This level of detail allowed the soldiers to approach the town with confidence, knowing exactly where the threats lay. The Americans were able to successfully capture Carrington thanks in no small part to the intelligence provided by McLaren's maps. Similarly, McLaren's maps helped the Allies plan their approach to the town of Streetlow, which was located further inland and was a key objective for the next phase of the invasion. The mapmakers' work highlighted the roads leading to the town and identified choke points where the Germans could potentially launch counterattacks. This allowed the Allies to plan their movements carefully, making sure they avoided these vulnerable points and moved efficiently toward their target. But the maps didn't just help the Allies in their approach to towns, they also played a crucial role in keeping the soldiers safe once they had secured key areas. In the days following the landings, the Allies were tasked with holding their positions and pushing forward, but they also had to defend against German counterattacks. The maps showed the location of natural obstacles, like rivers and hills, which could be used to establish defensive positions. They also highlighted areas where the Germans were most likely to regroup and counterattack. This information allowed the Allies to fortify their positions and prepare for the inevitable German response. Throughout the battle, McLaren's maps were an indispensable tool for the commanders on the ground. They helped with everything from strategic planning to navigating the toughest terrain. His maps were not just about the physical layout of the land, they were a guide to understanding the battlefield itself. By providing a clear, accurate picture of the environment, McLaren gave the Allies an edge in a battle where even the smallest advantage could make the difference between life and death. As the Allies continued their advance, it became clear that McLaren's maps had played a vital role in the success of the invasion. His work had saved countless lives and ensured that the troops were able to move efficiently through the treacherous terrain of Normandy. What had once been dismissed as unnecessary detail was now recognized as an essential part of the operation's success. The mapmaker, who had been mocked for his attention to the smallest details, had proven that precision was not just important, it was the key to victory. In the end, the importance of McLaren's maps was not just about their ability to guide the soldiers through Normandy, it was about the strategic advantage they provided. By giving the Allies a clear, detailed understanding of the terrain, McLaren's maps helped them navigate the challenges of the battle and ultimately secure victory. The maps became one of the unsung heroes of the D-Day invasion, a critical piece of the puzzle that allowed the Allies to push forward and liberate France. Without them, the operation would have been far more chaotic and far less successful. McLaren's work, once ridiculed, had proven to be nothing less than a game-changer. After the dust settled from the intense Battle of D-Day, the Allies were slowly but steadily pushing further into Nazi-occupied Europe. Normandy had been secured, but the real work was only beginning. In the aftermath of the invasion, the focus shifted from the beaches to the broader strategic objectives. Victory was still far from assured. But amidst the chaotic, bloody aftermath of the landings, one thing was clear. The once dismissed maps of Major James L. McLaren had played a pivotal role in the success of the operation. As the soldiers advanced and the fighting continued, McLaren's work, once ridiculed and mocked, was now being recognized for its essential role in the success of D-Day. Initially, his contributions had been brushed aside by many in the military. The grand generals and the strategists who crafted the high-level plans for the invasion hadn't seen the value in McLaren's maps. Some had outright dismissed them as overly detailed, impractical, and unnecessary. His efforts had seemed excessive, even laughable, to those who believed that the scale of the invasion would render such meticulous mapping irrelevant. But now, with the invasion's success largely attributed to careful planning and attention to detail, McLaren's maps were being praised. Military leaders who had once dismissed his work as trivial were now acknowledging their value. High-ranking officers, who had not seen the significance of a few extra details, were now coming to terms with the fact that McLaren's maps had, in fact, been a key factor in the Allied success. The detailed maps had guided soldiers through treacherous terrain, helped them avoid traps, and provided a clear, strategic advantage in the face of overwhelming opposition. However, while McLaren was receiving recognition from some corners, the situation was far from a simple victory for him. His path to recognition had been long and filled with doubt. He had faced ridicule from colleagues who were more concerned with grand strategy and battle tactics than with the minutiae of geography. Even after his maps proved their worth on D-Day, there were still lingering doubts and resentment among those who had dismissed him in the first place. Some were reluctant to admit they had been wrong about his work, and there were still murmurs of skepticism about how much McLaren's maps had truly influenced the outcome. Yet, the biggest form of revenge that McLaren could take was the eventual acknowledgement that his work had saved lives and played an essential role in ensuring the Allies were able to secure a foothold in Europe. Despite the initial mockery, McLaren's attention to detail had been precisely what was needed to navigate the complex and hostile terrain of Normandy. The soldiers who had landed on the beaches and fought in the hedgerows weren't thinking about strategy, they were thinking about survival. They didn't care about the maps that had been derided at first. They cared that those maps had led them to safety. And in the weeks following the invasion, as the Allies fought to expand their foothold and push deeper into France, McLaren's maps would continue to prove indispensable. But recognition for McLaren didn't come immediately. While some military leaders were vocal in their praise of his contributions, others remained less enthusiastic. McLaren had not been one of the generals or field commanders who had led the invasion. He had been a quiet figure in the background, working on the maps while others carried out the bold orders. This, perhaps, was the reason why his recognition was so delayed. Military history, particularly in times of war, tends to celebrate the commanders in the field, those who lead troops and make decisions in the heat of battle. McLaren had been far removed from that stage, and it took time for the true significance of his work to be fully understood. However, in the months and years following D-Day, McLaren would be quietly honored for his contribution. His maps became an essential part of military history, and his work was cited as an example of the importance of detailed planning in warfare. McLaren's maps were used in subsequent military operations, both in Europe and beyond, and became a model for how to approach military cartography in the future. His dedication to accuracy and his understanding of how terrain could affect the outcome of a battle changed the way the military thought about map-making. For McLaren, the recognition came more slowly than it should have. He had been ridiculed, dismissed, and mocked, but in the end, it was his maps that had helped save countless lives and turned the tide of the war. In the years after the invasion, McLaren's reputation would slowly rise, but the full recognition of his work would come only after he had passed away. It is said that some of the men who had once doubted him came to his grave to pay their respects, acknowledging that his maps had been, in their words, the key to victory. In a way, the slow but steady recognition of McLaren's work was his ultimate form of revenge against those who had doubted him. While he had not sought fame or glory, he had proved his worth through the undeniable results of his work. The mockery had been silenced by the success of the invasion and the continued use of his maps in subsequent military operations. And while McLaren was not the only hero of D-Day, his quiet contribution would eventually be seen as one of the cornerstones of the invasion's success. The story of the man whose maps were once ridiculed serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unlikely sources. McLaren's story is not just one of personal triumph. It is also a story about the value of persistence, attention to detail, and the quiet dedication of those who work behind the scenes. The mapmaker's revenge, in the end, was not about seeking recognition or proving others wrong. It was about knowing that his work had made a difference in one of the most crucial moments in history. That, ultimately, was enough. As the years passed after D-Day, the lasting impact of Major James L. McLaren's maps became more evident, not just within the military, but across the field of cartography and strategic planning. McLaren's work was initially overlooked and mocked, but the critical role it played in one of the most decisive military operations of the 20th century ensured that his legacy would endure. Today, his maps are recognized as masterpieces of military cartography, and his meticulous attention to detail has influenced how military strategies and operations are planned to this day. The most immediate impact of McLaren's maps was on the success of the Allied invasion of Normandy. His maps, which were once dismissed as overly detailed and impractical, proved to be vital tools that saved countless lives and guided soldiers through one of the most dangerous battles of the war. The soldiers who fought on the beaches and beyond relied on these maps for everything from navigating difficult terrain to avoiding enemy fire. His work helped to create a mental picture of the battlefield, allowing the troops to understand the terrain and the location of enemy positions in ways that would have been impossible with standard, broad-stroke maps. The importance of McLaren's maps went beyond D-Day. As the Allies pushed deeper into France and began liberating other territories, his maps continued to serve as a critical resource. They were used to plan subsequent military operations, including the liberation of Paris and the final push into Germany. McLaren's detailed maps, which accounted for the lay of the land, the positioning of key military targets, and the obstacles that soldiers would face, were integrated into the planning for these later campaigns. His maps became the standard for military operations in Normandy and beyond, helping commanders make informed decisions based on precise, actionable intelligence about the terrain and enemy positions. In the years after the war, McLaren's maps were used as teaching tools in military academies around the world. His approach to cartography, which combined the precision of a topographer with the strategic insight of a military planner, became a model for future generations of military mapmakers. The lessons learned from his work were incorporated into military training programs, and his maps became a key component in the study of the D-Day invasion. They were seen as the gold standard for how detailed, terrain-specific maps should be created to support large-scale military operations. In the broader field of cartography, McLaren's contributions were equally significant. His work revolutionized the way maps were created for military purposes. Before McLaren, military maps often relied on general surveys and broad, abstract features, with little regard for the minute details that could make or break an operation. McLaren's maps, however, were built with a focus on the small, seemingly insignificant details: hedgerows, minor roads, terrain depressions, and enemy fortifications. This level of detail allowed soldiers to make split-second decisions based on precise information, and it became the benchmark for how military maps would be designed moving forward. McLaren's influence extended beyond military applications, too. His work had an impact on the broader field of geographic information systems, GIS, and digital mapping. The principles he established, such as the importance of incorporating environmental features, human infrastructure, and obstacles into a map, are still used today in GIS technology. In the modern world, cartographers and geographers working in areas ranging from urban planning to disaster management often use similar methodologies to create maps that offer a comprehensive view of the terrain, helping decision-makers understand and navigate complex environments. Despite his immense contributions, McLaren never sought fame or recognition. He was a humble man, more focused on his work than on the accolades that came with it. His recognition came slowly and quietly, long after the war had ended, as the true significance of his maps became clear. While generals and soldiers received the lion's share of praise for D-Day's success, McLaren's maps were an essential, albeit unsung, component of the operation. His legacy, however, was ultimately cemented through the recognition of his work in military history and cartography. The irony of McLaren's story is that he became a hero not through the traditional routes of battle or military leadership, but through his ability to see the battlefield in a way that no one else could. Where others saw only the broader strokes of military strategy, McLaren saw the fine details, the curves in the landscape, the dips in the land, the hidden obstacles that could make all the difference between success and failure. His maps didn't just show the way. They predicted the course of the battle. They were designed with the understanding that terrain itself was a force to be reckoned with, and McLaren's ability to represent that force in his maps was what set his work apart. Today, McLaren is remembered not just for his maps, but for the mindset he embodied. A mindset that valued precision, attention to detail, and a commitment to making sure that every soldier on the ground had the information they needed to survive and succeed. His story is a reminder that sometimes the most important contributions come from the most unexpected places, and that even in a world full of bold heroes and sweeping military strategies, the smallest details can change the course of history. McLaren's legacy is more than just about cartography. It is about the power of persistence and the value of doing the hard work that others overlook. In the end, his maps didn't just guide soldiers through the battlefield. They helped guide the Allied forces to victory in the most critical invasion of World War II. And in doing so, they helped change the world. The story of Major James L. McLaren and his maps is one of those rare, often overlooked moments in history where the contribution of a single individual can change the course of an entire war. At the outset, McLaren's work was dismissed as unnecessary and trivial by many in the military, mocked for its focus on detail when broad strokes were deemed sufficient. But as the tides of war surged, his maps became invaluable, guiding soldiers through the chaos of Normandy and playing a critical role in the success of the D-Day invasion. What was once ridiculed now stands as one of the most crucial elements of military planning during World War II. The success of the D-Day landings wasn't just about the bravery of the soldiers or the grand strategies of the generals. It was also about the small details, the intricacies of terrain, the hidden dangers, and the precise routes that led to victory. McLaren's work, often seen as excessive, was in fact the difference between life and death for countless soldiers. His maps, filled with specific details about the geography of Normandy, provided essential information for those who needed to move quickly, think critically, and navigate a landscape designed to kill them. In the aftermath of the invasion, the strategic importance of McLaren's maps slowly became clear. The Allied forces had fought hard, but it was the knowledge McLaren provided that allowed them to succeed in the face of overwhelming odds. The hedgerows, the enemy positions, the dangerous terrain, all of these elements were mapped out with precision, and the soldiers who relied on these maps were able to move more effectively and safely, avoiding the traps that might have otherwise been their undoing. McLaren's maps were the unsung heroes of the operation, quietly influencing the success of the invasion without ever being in the spotlight. It was only after the war, and after years of posthumous recognition, that McLaren's contributions were truly acknowledged. And yet, even in his quiet, understated approach to his work, McLaren's legacy endures, not just as a mapmaker but as a testament to the power of persistence, attention to detail, and the quiet, unheralded heroes who work behind the scenes to make success possible. The story of McLaren's maps is not only a lesson in the importance of precision and thoroughness in military planning, but also a reminder of the unexpected ways that history can unfold. His legacy transcends the narrow confines of cartography and serves as a broader metaphor for the value of overlooked efforts that contribute to monumental success. While McLaren may have been an anonymous figure to many at the time, today, his work is a cornerstone of military history, and his contribution is seen as indispensable to the success of D-Day. In closing, McLaren's story teaches us that it is often the smallest details, the unseen efforts, and the quiet dedication that make the most significant impact. As the world remembers D-Day and the sacrifice of those who fought, we also remember the mapmaker whose vision and commitment to detail helped change the world. His maps were more than just tools for navigation, they were the difference between disaster and victory, and in a way, they helped shape the outcome of the war. It is the story of a man who, despite facing ridicule and doubt, remained steadfast in his belief that attention to the smallest details could lead to monumental success. And in the end, that faith was rewarded, securing McLaren's place in history as an unsung hero of one of the most significant events of the 20th century.